He used to be called Citizen 625726. He used to call himself Unbroken. When he left his dystopian city behind, he thought he had found paradise. What he found was uglier and darker than anything he could have imagined. This is his story. This is Inferior. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at StudioBrainstorm.net. Links in the description. The origins of Vector are really not that surprising, especially when you consider the context in which it was first conceived. The story begins in late 2006, when Dark Horse editor Randy Stradley and artist Chris Warner were visiting a comic shop. They just happened to be visiting it right around the time that the shop's staff was unloading the latest shipment of comics, the vast majority of which came from two series that many comic book fans and certainly superhero fans should be very familiar with: Marvel's Civil War crossover series and DC's 52 crossover series. Thanks to the Marvel movie of the same name, most people know the plotline of Civil War, a schism within the Avengers over the idea of whether or not the US government should regulate the actions of superheroes. Meanwhile, DC 52 mostly serves as a filler between two other major DC comic runs, Infinite Crisis and 1 Year Later, mostly focusing on various DC secondary heroes as the big three, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, have gone into temporary retirement. This is not to be confused in any way with the infamous New 52 series, which came out in 2011. At any rate, Stradley was really impressed by the success of these two comic series, and decided that maybe Dark Horse and Star Wars should do a crossover event of its own. Stradley was already writing his own Star Wars comic, the Darth Vader-focused Dark Times, so he decided to approach Miller, as well as Rob Williams, the principal writer for Star Wars Rebellion, and John Ostrander, the writer of Star Wars Legacy, and pitched to them the idea of a crossover plotline that would link their four respective series together. Lest we forget, KOTOR the comic is set roughly 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. Dark Times is set during the period between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. Rebellion obviously takes place during the original trilogy period, while Legacy takes place about 130 years after the Battle of Yavin, the farthest advanced in the timeline of the old expanded universe prior to Disney rendering all that non-canon, quote-unquote. Eventually, all four writers agreed on a sequential crossover that would intersect each of their respective series, and it was Stradley that came up with the title Vector, a mathematical term referring to a line that connects 2 points in space. In total, KOTOR's contribution to the Vector storyline would take up 4 chapters. Chapters that Miller had originally planned to dedicate towards events following the aftermath of Knights of Suffering, the attempted assassination of Cassis Fett, and the fate of the Taris Resistance, as well as those of his principal characters. Now, almost all of that had to be scrapped in order to make room for Vector. Miller does handle the inclusion of this crossover storyline fairly well, but you can clearly see the obvious stitching, narratively speaking, where he splices it into his narrative. This time, the cover art for issue 1 was done by Travis Charest, while the other 3 issues were drawn by Dustin Weaver. Meanwhile, the interiors for all 4 issues of KOTOR Vector were done by Scott Hepburn, who also did some work on the Clone Wars comic series. And oh boy, you remember how I said earlier that while I wasn't a fan of Bong Dazo's art, I also said his wasn't the worst in the series? That's because Hepburn's is undeniably the worst in this series. It's obvious the man is trying for a stylized aesthetic, but it comes off looking cartoony at best and downright ugly at worst. Thank God this is his only contribution to the series. The story begins 1 month after the events of Nights of Suffering, and it begins with yet another Jedi vision of the future. The 3 remaining seers of the Covenant's first watch circle, Canilia, Zaymar, and Feln, see themselves fighting hordes of rock ghouls amidst the ruins of a city that might be Coruscant. However, instead of attacking like a swarm of mindless beasts as they would in real life, the rock ghouls in the vision fight with coordination and purpose, as if they are being directed by a single mind and a single will. As Canilia dramatically calls it the end of everything, we get this double-page spread. And as much as I've just dunked on Scott Hepburn for having the weakest art in this comic series, he does have his moments, and I would say this is his best image. That is how you introduce a Sith Lord. But as to who this Sith is and what his fancy neck bling might be, we'll have to wait for a few more pages, as the 3 seers snap out of the vision, but not before seeing 4 figures that would have been very familiar to comic fans who would have been reading all 4 of the series that are involved in this crossover. Zane, obviously, but also Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, representing the Rebellion and Dark Times storylines respectively, and Cade Skywalker, the main protagonist of Legacy. Once the 3 seers are brought back to reality by Lucy and Dre, they describe the vision and claim that they recognize the strange artifact that the Sith Lord from the vision was wearing as the Myrrh Talisman. Not a lot of backstory given for this artifact in the series, so for context, history lesson time. Prior to the Battle of Ruusan and the supposed extinction of the Sith, the Jedi Order would endure 4 horrific conflicts known as the Great Schisms. This topic has been brought up in prior episodes of this series of mine. The 3rd Great Schism was mentioned in passing in Tales of the Jedi. It was never really elaborated on except that it occurred 2.5 centuries prior to the Great Sith War. Then there was the 4th Great Schism, which set off the 1,000-year-long conflict known as the New Sith Wars, as well as the Republic Dark Age, the setting of the Knight Errant series, which was also written by John Jackson Miller. The First Great Schism, and details associated with it, like Arden Lyn, Zendor, and the legions of Latau, aren't elaborated on much either. It only really is mentioned in certain codex entries from the Old Republic MMO and a few supplementary books like the New Essential Chronology. The Myrrh Talisman and its creation are a product of the Second Great Schism. 3,000 years prior to the events of the Mandalorian Wars, circa 7,000 BBY, a small sect within the Jedi Order began experimenting, pushing the limits of exactly what the Force was capable of. After a while, they began to discover that the Force, that nebulous energy field that connects and is produced by all living things, could, with sufficient skill, be used to alter life itself. This power could alter existing life forms or even create new ones that could be extensions of the Jedi's will. The more idealistic among their number began to speculate that perhaps such power could be used to extend life indefinitely or resuscitate dead worlds. However, the mainstream of the Jedi Order was suspicious that such power could easily be abused. They weren't far wrong, after all, as Palpatine himself put it in Revenge of the Sith.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
In the end, though, this little schismatic group, eventually known as the Dark Jedi, refused to renounce their newfound power, and thus began a war that would last for 100 years. Karnes Myrrh was one of these rogue Dark Jedi, and, with the help of fellow exile Sorzu Sin, created the Myrrh Talisman. The Dark Jedi had already learned how to use the Force to alter life forms into monsters that they could use against their enemies, known as Sith spawn, but the Myrrh Talisman functioned as a focal point, allowing Karnes Myrrh, its holder, to use his power on a greater scale, convert entire armies into gibbering monsters bound to his will. In the end, though, even with armies of Sith spawn bolstering their numbers, the Dark Jedi were simply too few, and they were ultimately defeated by the Order and the Republic. While many in the Senate called for the surviving Dark Jedi to be executed, the Order, as was typical, offered instead the mercy of exile. The prisoners were packed aboard ships and sent off to the Outer Rim, in the hope that they might think upon their mistakes and learn the error of their ways. Instead, the surviving Dark Jedi, including Carness Mur, discovered Korriban and the Sith species. With their power over the Force, they would essentially set themselves up as God Kings over the hapless natives, thus giving birth to the first Sith Empire. At any rate, when the Jedi Seers had their vision, they saw rock ghouls and they saw Zane Carrick. Rock ghouls only exist in the Undercity of Taris, and Zane was last seen on Taris. And since the First Watch Circle still believe that Zane is destined to bring about the return of the Sith as per the prophecy of the Rogue Moon, they jump to the logical conclusion that Zane might use the Mur Talisman for evil, and they have to stop him as soon as possible. Unfortunately for them, their fellow consular, Rana Tay, who was also on Taris, is now dead, and thanks to the orders of the Jedi Council, the 4 remaining members can't act together without exposing the Covenant's existence. Never mind the fact that Taris is now a war zone occupied by the Mandalorians. Luckily for the Covenant, there is another option. Years ago, at the request of the Jedi Council, Lucien's mother and leader of the Covenant, Crinda Dre, began taking in students, ostensibly to be trained in the ways of the Jedi. And for the most part, she did just that. However, those that she saw as useful to her secret cause, she inducted into the Covenant. While she primarily focused on Jedi with the ability to see the future, allowing the Covenant to predict any sign of the Sith's return, the Covenant also took in Jedi whose abilities would allow them to act upon those predictions. These shadows were later scattered across the galaxy. All records of them were erased so that neither the Republic nor the Jedi Order even knew they existed, allowing them to act with impunity in service of the Covenant's interests. After all, it's a lot harder to track down and deal with people who officially don't exist. As serendipity would have it, there is a shadow ready and available near Taris. Thus, we are introduced to the principal character of the entire Vector crossover storyline, Celeste Morn. Unfortunately, this is the part where we can clearly see the remnants of the storyline Miller was originally going to use, and the stitching that he used instead to splice in Vector. We have the very first example in this storyline of Miller resorting to clunky exposition dumps in order to connect the events of Knights of Suffering to Vector. But he agreed to do this crossover thing, so there's no one to blame but himself. Celeste encounters first Constable Sour from Knights of Suffering, and then Zane and Griff. Between the 3 of them, we learn that the Taris resistance has been effectively crushed by Cassis Fett and the Mandalorians. Many were able to escape off-world, but those who were unable or unwilling to leave were continuously forced downwards into the lower levels of the city by the Mandalorians. Eventually, they were driven into the Undercity, which is infested with rock ghouls. Ever since, what few survivors of the Taris resistance remain have been scraping by in the Undercity, trying to avoid both the Mandalorians and the rock ghouls with their infectious mutagenic virus. Celeste is forced to kill the constable when it's revealed that she was bitten by a rock ghoul and is thus infected with the virus, at which point Zane and Griff run into her. Apparently, they'd recently been kicked out of one of the outcast communities in the Undercity after Griff compromised their defenses just so that he could go scrounging for marketable material. Initially, Celeste wants nothing to do with either of them, but they tag along anyway simply because they have nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. Their only ride, the Mumo Willowa, is busy transporting refugees from Taris into the safety of Republic space. Celeste eventually discovers who Zane is, but after watching him bicker with Griff like 2 children, she can hardly believe that someone as incompetent as this could be the Padawan murderer, which is ironic because that's what Zane's been saying this whole time. A sudden explosion from above causes the floor to fall out from under them, and when the trio awaken, they find themselves in an even deeper part of the Undercity, and that there are Mandalorians nearby. Worse yet, the Mandos have just discovered the Mur Talisman. Zane recognizes the leader as Pulsifer, one of Demigol's assistants, and in fact there was a Mandalorian warrior in yellow armor back in Flashpoint. Celeste couldn't care less about that, however. What matters to her is that he has the Myrrh Talisman, and her mission is to get it. Using a jetpack from some dead Mandalorians, she takes off in pursuit, and Zane and Griff follow, because again, they have nowhere else to go. This is part 1 of a 4-issue arc, and quite frankly, it is the weakest. Not just in this arc, but arguably in the entire series. Luckily, from part 2 onwards, it does get better. Our unlikely trio stow away aboard Pulsifer's ship, which finally arrives at its destination, an ice world controlled by the Mandalorians called Jebel. Hiding in the air vents, listening to Pulsifer rant and rave about his ambitions and how no one respects him, it's pretty clear this particular Mandalorian has an impressive chip on his shoulder. And none of the other Mandalorians, even his own subordinates, like him all that much. For one, he was associated with Demagol and openly brags that he wishes to supplant his old boss, and frankly, the Mandalorians didn't like Demagol either. The second is down to the simple fact that Mandalorians are a warrior culture, and as a general rule, warriors have very little respect for those who aren't, including scientists, or in this case, would-be scientists. Pulsifer is obsessed with unlocking the secrets of the Myrrh Talisman. The only useful detail gleaned from all his rantings is that during the attack on Taris, he swiped a lot of data about the Jedi, and this happens to include financial information regarding the Dre Trust, but we'll come back to that later. Celeste attempts to mind trick Pulsifer into throwing the Myrrh Talisman out the airlock, but instead the Sith artifact comes to life and briefly seems to possess him, causing him to lash out at some of his own warriors. After the ship has landed, Celeste manages to give Zane and Griff the slip, who are swiftly discovered. Luckily, rather than seeing them as intruders or a threat, the Mandalorians assume that they are recruits. Actually, that's not the right word, because recruit implies that you volunteered. The word I'm looking for is conscripts. It would seem that as the Mandalorians pushed through the Outer Rim and into Republic space, they've been snapping up every lowlife and criminal they can get their armored hands on. Jebel is a training ground where these conscripts are going to be trained in the Mandalorian ways of war and essentially forced to become Mandalorian foot soldiers. One of the red armored officers, called a rally master, basically explains the situation and what is expected of these new conscripts. He informs them that armor tailored for each of their respective species is being made in the nearby Warforge, and that once Cassis Fett brings the transport ships from Taris, they are going to be launching a massive raid deep into Republic territory. Their target? Alderaan. Because of course, Alderaan. Alderaan the Peaceful, with no defenses and no weapons. Honestly, this is why pacifist factions and characters are very, very hard to pull off in fiction without coming off looking like idiots. I swear, it's a miracle that world even lasted long enough to be blasted apart by the Death Star. Luckily for our heroes, it's easy to sneak away in a big crowd. They manage to reunite with Celeste, and Griff, mastermind that he is, comes up with a plan to get them inside the Warforge so that they can try and recover the Myrrh Talisman from Pulsifer. Wearing some scavenged Mandalorian armor, after all, the Neo-Crusaders are all about inducting multiple species into their ranks, the Snivian pretends to be escorting 2 prisoners to Pulsifer for interrogation. And because he is a natural con man, he's able to persuade the guards to let them in. Alas, Griff's way with words are not equaled by his way with blasters. And in a moment that comes off as a little too contrived for my liking, he mishandles his gun and causes a cave-in, separating himself from Zane and Celeste. The 2 Jedi are soon accosted by Mandalorian soldiers, and, just to make things even worse, they start transforming into rock ghouls, as if the virus that creates them had somehow escaped Taris and come to Jebel. And from here on out, it just keeps going from bad to worse. The rock ghouls start spreading throughout the Warforge, biting and infecting anyone they come across. Then it turns out that these rock ghouls aren't ordinary feral monsters. They're actually smart enough to coordinate attacks and use weapons. And then, just to make it even worse, Celeste and Zane find a balcony overlooking the ice fields of Jebel and realize that Jebel's not just a recruiting ground, it's a staging ground. Every Mandalorian conscript seems to be assembled on Jebel for the attack on Alderaan. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of soldiers just waiting to be infected with the rock ghoul virus. an army of potential incubators ready to spread that virus into the heart of Republic space. Chaos breaks out on the rally fields as the rock ghouls start spilling out of the forge and attack the conscripts and their rally masters. Celeste and Zane narrowly escape the chaos and head for a comm station that they hope will be powerful enough to reach the Republic so they can warn them about the impending invasion and the rock ghoul plague. In the meantime, Celeste learns about Zane's backstory and how he's gotten into this mess. And at this point, knowing him as well as she does, Celeste isn't really sure what to make of him. He certainly doesn't seem like the kind of person who would commit murder, and frankly it seems he's only survived as long as he has due to sheer dumb luck, or maybe the will of the Force. But of course, she's a member of the Covenant. People like Lucy and Dre, after all, are her superiors, and she has known them for far longer. Or at least she thought she did. Back inside the Warforge, Griff has somehow managed to avoid detection by the rock ghouls. He's still looking for that financial information, and hopefully codes that will let him access the Dre Trust because money. Instead, he discovers a message from Lucy and Dre. Thus, Griff learns that the Myrrh Talisman might be responsible for the rock ghoul plague, and that Celeste is an agent of the Covenant. Meanwhile, while Zane keeps watch outside the comm station, Celeste makes contact with Lucy and Dre. She does pass on the warning about the rock ghouls and the impending invasion of Alderaan, but when she gets to the subject of Zane, the conversation becomes pretty much what you would expect, with Celeste beginning to have doubts about whether or not Zane really is a murderer, and Lucian, of course, insisting that he is and that she should eliminate him as soon as possible. The conversation also reveals that Celeste is an orphan, as her family were among the many casualties of the Sith War. A little reminder that the Covenant and its many agents exist precisely because of the events of Tales of the Jedi. Despite her orders, though, when Zane is busy sending off his message to the Mumo Willowa to pick up him and Griff, Celeste just can't bring herself to kill him. Then, as if to compound Celeste's doubts, Zane decides to send a warning to the Mandalorians. He actually gets into conversation with Cassis Fett and warns him not to land on Jebel lest the rock ghoul virus spread to his own warriors. Fett is unsurprisingly skeptical and even asks point blank why someone from the Republic would want to help the enemy, to which Zane simply replies, "Your people." If his attempt to save Rana Tay back in Nights of Suffering hadn't already clinched it, this is pretty much the moment where Zane cements his certified good boy status. Then, just to put the cherry on top, he decides to go back into the Warforge to try and find and rescue Griff, leaving Celeste even more confused and doubtful than before, as his actions aren't exactly those of a supposed Sith Lord in the making. Before we continue on with the story though, a note on Cassis Fett. Obviously this character technically began as just some flavor text in reference to some items that you could acquire in Knights of the Old Republic the game, namely Cassis Fett's armor and blaster. Not exactly a lot of foundation upon which to build a character, and in some ways a historically significant character, given that if his name wasn't already a giveaway, this is the man who will essentially be the progenitor of a lineage that results in Jango and Boba Fett. All that said though, this really is only one of two significant appearances that Fett makes in the entire series. Most of the time, whenever he's mentioned at all, it's always through other people talking about him. This was apparently by design on Miller's part, as he believed that, like Vader, less is more with Cassis Fett. I do see his logic, but frankly I don't quite agree and think that there should have been a little bit more of this guy. The only things we ever learn about him as a character are that he's Mandalore's most trusted follower and that he's incredibly pragmatic and ruthless, almost always prioritizing achieving an objective over adherence to tradition and Mandalorian honor. Funnily enough, the closest thing he has to a serious character moment comes not from the comic itself, but from a supplementary material. See, in KOTOR the comic, each issue often included an extra thing called a news organ, a single-page in-universe news broadcast, usually only one page, and was included mostly to flesh out the universe. One of these was called the Taris Holofeed, and the very last issue of this, quote-unquote, is a speech made by Cassis Fett to the people of Taris after he has successfully conquered the planet, where he essentially says, "You are no longer part of the Republic, you belong to the Mandalorians now." According to Miller himself, Fett's speech was adapted from a real-life speech made by General Stephen Kearny, an American officer who served in the Mexican-American War. Specifically, it was a proclamation he made in Las Vegas, New Mexico, proclaiming that the area now belonged to the US. So yeah, really cool conceptual character, but not really fully explored to my satisfaction. Naturally, Zane is ambushed by the rock ghouls when he tries to go back into the Warforge, but instead of killing him, they drag him off to a meeting with Pulsifer. Pulsifer was already pretty obsessive, if not outright monomaniacal. Now, with the dark side influence of the Myrrh talisman messing with his head, he's become more than a little deranged. He straps Zane down to a slab and tries to interrogate him as to how to unlock the full powers of the artifact, as if a former Padawan would have any idea as to how a Sith artifact does what it does. But Pulsifer was never one to take no for an answer, and he threatens to either throw Zane to the Rak Ghouls or lock him up in another Sith artifact known as Drapa's Oubliette if he doesn't tell him what he wants to know. The Oubliette is basically a stasis chamber, but being that it was made by the Sith, it was intended to be used as a torture device, essentially leaving the victim inside conscious and aware of the passage of time, but utterly incapable of escaping from it. While Pulsifer rants and raves at Zane, the Myrrh talisman suddenly comes to life again. It detaches from the Mandalorian and tries to latch onto Zane. Without the talisman to control them, the Rock Ghouls promptly tear Pulsifer to pieces. Oh, what a shame. Luckily, Celeste arrives in time to save Zane from being possessed by the Myrrh talisman. Unfortunately, that means she's the one who gets possessed instead, as she sees a vision of the Sith Lord Karness Myrrh, the talisman's creator, as he ominously declares that she is his future. I've already talked about how Miller is usually really good with dialogue. But something that I also mentioned way back in Knight Errant is that he really knows how to write a good villain monologue. And he begins KOTOR Vector Issue 4 with a quote from Karness Myrrh himself. "And though the enemy brought great numbers to the field of battle, for every number there is a negative. Their strength became my own, their minds became my own. All flesh is my flesh, none moves save I will it. This is the rule the Sith were promised, and I have made it real." With the Myrrh talisman latched on to her, Celeste now completely controls the Rock Ghouls on Jebel, and by now they've either killed or infected every Mandalorian on the planet. Not even my beloved Basilisk war droids are of any use against such overwhelming numbers and coordination. Unlike with Pulsifer, the Myrrh talisman opens all of its secrets to Celeste, and she reveals to Zane that besides the ability to mutate living beings into Sith spawn, it carves away the victim's identity while also leaving memories of their knowledge and skills intact. This is why these new Rock Ghouls are able to use weapons and even operate technology, but only when there is a mind and will to direct them. This is why the Rock Ghouls on Terrace are feral and mindless. There was no direction, because there was no one using the Myrrh talisman. Griff is brought in by one of the Rock Ghouls, and he reveals Celeste's association with the Covenant to Zane. Unfortunately, it's pretty clear that the spirit of Karness Myrrh is still very much alive and well inside of his namesake talisman, and the spirit of the old Sith Lord is determined to take over Celeste's mind. Already he is capable of influencing her darker emotions, and when Zane and Griff try to argue with her about the Covenant's dirty dealings, she lashes out at them in anger. Luckily, Zane is able to snap her out of it by pointing out the obvious. The Covenant's mission is to prevent the Sith threat from returning? Well, what could be a bigger example of a Sith threat than what's currently on Jebel? An army of Sith spawn controlled by a malignant darkside artifact that is well on its way to possessing a Jedi. If anybody seems likely to bring about the Sith's return at this moment, it's Celeste herself. This realization, combined with the fact that she can sense Karness Myrrh eating away at her consciousness, sends Celeste into despair, and she begs Zane to kill her before it's too late. They can't simply detach the Myrrh talisman because it will simply latch on to a new host. And since Myrrh clearly wants to possess a Force sensitive, Zane would be its most likely target. However, Zane is unwilling to kill Celeste, and instead suggests an alternative. Rather than kill Celeste, he plans to seal her inside Drapa's oubliette, in the hopes that she will be safe there until they can find someone who can remove the artifact safely. Celeste reluctantly agrees to the plan, and before she is sealed inside, she gives Zane some helpful information. First, when the Mumo Willowa comes to pick them all up, she says that Zane should take her, within the oubliette obviously, to Audren, to a place called the Sanctum of the Exalted. Supposedly there are Covenant researchers there that might be able to safely remove the Myrrh talisman from her, and she gives him a key that will allow them entry. She also reveals of the familial connection between Lucien Dray and Crinda, the Covenant's leader. Now that she's convinced that Zane is in fact an innocent person, she believes that if Zane wants to clear his name, the best thing he can do is to get into contact with Crinda Dray herself. If he is indeed innocent, Celeste is convinced that Crinda would never have signed off on the murder of the Padawans. Celeste still firmly believes in the rightness of the Covenant's cause, and that gaining Crinda's support would not only purge this potential rogue element, represented by Lucien Dray, but would also help Zane clear his name. Zane promises to come back for her and seals Celeste inside. Cut off from the Myrrh talisman's influence, the rock ghouls revert to a feral state. Luckily, the Mumo Willowa arrives in time to save Zane and Griff before they are eaten, or worse. But before Zane can convince them to turn back and recover the oubliette with Celeste inside, the Mandalorian fleet arrives. Fortunately, it seems that Cassus Fett chose to believe Zane's warning and doesn't land any of his ships on the planet. Unfortunately, he apparently decides that the best course of action is to launch a planetary bombardment, destroying the Citadel, the staging ground, and every rock ghoul on the planet's surface. Zane is completely devastated. It's Sirocco all over again. Worse yet, the bombardment has surely destroyed Celeste, meaning that he's failed in his promise to help her. Cassus Fett briefly contacts the Mumo Willowa, thanking Zane for his warning and saying that the Mandalorians are in his debt before allowing them to depart peacefully. Unlike Sirocco, however, this time Zane's grief swiftly gives way to an iron determination. If he wasn't already committed to bringing down the Covenant and proving his innocence, he certainly is now. Just like his friends on Taris, Celeste has been sacrificed on the altar of the Covenant's paranoid obsession with the Sith. For her sake, if for nothing else, Zane is now more determined than ever to bring the Covenant down. And thanks to Celeste, he might now just have the key to do it. Unfortunately, it doesn't occur to any of our heroes aboard the Willowa that Drapa's oubliette might have been built to last. And as the Willowa departs Jebel, the final panels of Vector reveal that the oubliette is still very much intact, meaning that Celeste is still alive and trapped, and she's going to stay that way for nearly 4,000 years. And, need I remind you, she's going to be fully conscious for the entire duration. Only Arden Lin from the Masters of Terraskasi fighting game can claim an even longer stasis imprisonment, upwards of 20,000 standard years. Yeesh. At any rate, we won't be seeing Celeste mourn again until such time as I cover the Dark Times and Rebellion storylines. Never mind Legacy. In the meantime, we are homing in on the second of the three major climaxes of KOTOR the comic. But before Zane Carrick can bring down the Covenant, he needs to get proof. Next time, we'll find out just how successful he is at this in Exalted. Until then.